Dear colleagues, I did get COVID for the second time 2 weeks ago. The only sort of side effect is that my voice sometimes still breaks. So if my voice breaks, it's not because of emotional turmoil, although of course being in this distinguished group is a very emotional experience, but that may not be the reason. So this presentation is sort of partly philosophical, partly educational. It's an outgrowth of the work that I've been doing along with Tyler van der Wiele at the Harvard Flourishing program as consultants for OECD, because OECD is finally planning after 35 years to change its international educational policy. And the remit, the task they gave me as a philosopher was to create some kind of a consensual model of flourishing that all the OECD nations could agree on. An easy task, obviously. Right, so academia is like an aircraft carrier. It moves very slowly and is difficult to turn around. In the last few years, one such aircraft carrier has begun to move. I'm referring here to the concept of human flourishing, or eudaimonia, denoting predominantly objective features of human well-being that has recently come into vogue within various areas of the humanities and the social sciences, philosophy, psychology, economics, health sciences, and education. After playing only a marginal role since its halcyon days within ancient theorizing about the good life, in particular in Aristotle. So when I say this has happened recently, I mean recently, because I wrote this book about flourishing in 2020. If I had written this book now in 2024, I would have written a completely different book, because the discourse has moved on so much. In this book, I had to create all kinds of straw men and, possible objectors, because there were no objectors around, but now they have certainly come out of all the rabbit holes, so I would have had to write a very different book now. Okay, so this development is perhaps most noticeable within education, where the concept of flourishing is certainly all the rage. Most conspicuously seen by the fact that the two biggest international policymakers in the field, OECD, which runs the notorious PISA international tests comparing countries in terms of their 15-year-old students' educational achievements, is considering dropping its decades-old human capital theory about the aims of education as mainly utilitarian and economical, and adopting a human flourishing paradigm. I've been working as a consultant, as I said, with OECD on this project for over a year, along with Professor Tyler van der Wiele at Harvard, who's a well-known measurement designer in the field of flourishing research. And on this screen, you see now a slide with two important recent reports by OECD and UNESCO on this new way of thinking about education, which is quite remarkable because, as some of you may know, OECD and UNESCO have been fighting a battle about education for the last 35 years and never agree on anything. UNESCO is always very fluffy and airy-fairy, and OECD is always very STEM subject-oriented, but now they seem to be coming together under this umbrella of flourishing. So why this sudden burst of interest in flourishing? Philosophers may be tempted to say that the springboard of the interest lies in the revival of virtue ethics and the simultaneous setback for instrumentalist cost-benefit analysis of the utilitarian kind. Educationists will no doubt add the insight that the recently fashionable approach of character education as the educational incarnation of virtue ethics has inspired the flourishing agenda, because the foundational concept of character education, harking back to Aristotle, is actually flourishing rather than good character. Psychologists may then refer to the recent rise of interest within their discipline in normative issues, including constructs of character and virtues in positive psychology. all of which require an overall objective conception of the good life. So this conference is about what makes a good human life. My simple answer is that a good human life, a life lived well, is a flourishing life. To ground this claim theoretically would require either a deep philosophical exploration, which might sound too academically siloed to some people in this audience, or an extensive overview of the social scientific research on people's beliefs about flourishing around the world, which would exceed by far the time and space allocated to me here. So I will evade this grounding question through a simple rhetorical trick that I picked up from Aristotle. Ask a person about any of her life goals and why these are important to her. Continue asking the why question until you hit rock bottom and the question becomes senseless. Where does that rock bottom lie? It is when the person answers you by saying that her deepest life goal is leading a good, flourishing life. A further questioning on why she would want to live a good, flourishing life sounds inane. Hence, we seem to have hit the ungrounded grounder, a justification that is psychologically foundational. Now, if I'm going to make do with a fairly curt answer to the grounding question, what am I going to talk about? I'm going to explore a question that was put to me by the well-informed but very practically minded experts at OECD. They said, "We like this concept of flourishing, but there seem to be many conceptualizations, indeed as many as there are flourishing theorists. Is there any way to reconcile these conceptualizations in a way that would allow for international operationalizations and measurements?" So I'm proposing to talk to you today, therefore, about the variety of accounts of flourishing, their respective pros and cons, and the prospect of synthesizing them into some kind of a consensual specification. For reasons of space, I focus on Western and secular accounts only here and leave the Western religious traditions as well as Eastern accounts such as Buddhism, Confucianism, and the African Ubuntu conception mostly out of reckoning. However, obviously OECD was not happy with this choice, so they said, well, you've got to deal with the Eastern accounts also, because otherwise we're never going to get this through our participating countries, and OECD, as you may know, has a veto policy, so any one or two countries can veto a major decision about education. So I created an online webinar about Confucianism, Buddhism, and Ubuntu, getting experts from these fields to speak, and there's a YouTube link to that there if anybody is interested. But the main conclusion was that actually these three Eastern accounts, or African accounts, they sort of coincided reasonably well with the synthesized account that I will be talking to you about later. So this is sort of elementary, my dear Watson, for some of you in this audience, but I'll just go through it very quickly. Let's begin with higher up the conceptual ladder than with flourishing. The term well-being is generally accepted within psychology, at least, as a conceptualization of the good human life. If we understand well-being as an umbrella concept, there are two main accounts of well-being competing for priority under the umbrella. A subjective account considers the criteria of well-being to be subjective in the sense that they all have to do with the psychological states, experiences, attitudes, feelings, beliefs of an agent. On an objective account, however, the criteria of well-being have to do with objective features of the agent, facts about her life that can in principle be viewed from an external perspective and to which she may or may not be privy. Subjective accounts can be divided further into hedonic and life satisfaction accounts. On the former, well-being is identified with pleasure as a raw, undifferentiated subjective feeling. On the life satisfaction accounts, well-being signals the ratio of one's perceived life accomplishments and fortunes to one's aspirations. Hedonic and life satisfaction accounts have been combined to form widely used measures of overall subjective well-being, SWB. More relevant for present purposes are the objective accounts, of which the flourishing ones tend to be seen as instantiations. There is also a variety of objective accounts on offer, obviously. Finally, there are some well-being accounts that are truly hybrid, incorporating objective and subjective features in equal measure. For example, Carol Riff's account. It's often noted that the distinction between objective and subjective accounts may be tenuous, as measures of the two types of well-being turn out to be fairly well correlated. Yet there is a logical reason for keeping them clearly separated for present purposes. The reason is that it is possible to offer at least hypothetical counterexamples to an equivalence thesis, namely of a person who enjoys objective but not subjective well-being, in ordinary language, a person who is flourishing but not happy, and vice versa. The philosopher Wittgenstein, flourishing but chronically grumpy, is often taken as an example of the former, and the painter Gauguin, floundering but joyful, is an example of the latter. These may be statistical outliers, but they matter for analytic purposes. All that said, none of the four main Western approaches I explore later in this presentation, namely Aristotelianism, liberalism, positive psychology, and self-determination theory, are purely objective. All of them contain some subjective features. For example, the Aristotelian approach incorporates a certain kind of pleasure, supervening upon successfully enacted activities as a necessary feature of flourishing. Nevertheless, all these approaches give priority, logical and developmental, to the objective features. Even Seligman's 2011 positive psychological approach considers all the components of flourishing, some of which are subjective, to be underpinned by character strengths and virtues as objective features. It is therefore valid to offer as the initial conceptual condition for an account of well-being to pass muster as a flourishing account that it must either feature objective components of well-being only, or mix objective and subjective components in a way that gives priority to the former. So next, over to four standard Western approaches. There is no set number of approaches to flourishing that indisputably deserve a mention here. Different approaches and variants abound, often just differentiated by the preferred vocabularies and priorities of the individual authors. I will single out four standard Western approaches for consideration. One approach is developed from moral philosophy, Aristotle's. One from political philosophy, liberalism or the liberal approach. And two from psychology, positive psychology and self-determination theory, or SDT. I will be spending quite a lot of time going through this slide, so you'll have lots of time to digest it. So basically there I'm sort of putting up what I consider to be the main strengths and weaknesses, possible weaknesses of each of these four Western accounts, which are all hybrid to a certain extent, although the objective features predominate. Now, the natural place to begin is obviously with Aristotle's account, as all subsequent versions tend to have an Aristotelian tincture and provenance. Aristotle's original concept of flourishing as eudaimonia rests on one fundamental argument, the so-called function argument, according to which human beings have a natural function, just as an oak tree or a tiger, a function that can be identified objectively by looking at what humans are best at. Human nature presses teleologically towards its specific human function, its humanness. The function peculiar to human beings, according to Aristotle, is the soul's activity and action that express reason. As each function is completed well when its completion expresses the proper virtue, the human good, quote, turns out to be the soul's activity that expresses virtue, infused with reason, or Phronesis, unquote. What is proper to each thing's nature, here reason-infused virtue, is, Aristotle says, supremely best and pleasantest for it, unquote. Hence, to flourish or live well in the distinctive human way will give human beings a kind of pleasure as an ornament, a type of flow, later defined by Csikszentmihalyi as pleasure in unimpeded, successfully enacted activities. It is part of human psychology to enjoy the exercise of our realized human capabilities. The same goes ideally for learning this exercise, for instance at school, for something is not right according to the Aristotelian conception if that fails to happen. Unfortunately, international comparisons show that only about 1 to 5% of students ever claim to have experienced flow in the classroom. This is why, as noted previously, that the Aristotelian approach to educational flourishing is not a purely objective one because of this pleasure or flow element. Flourishing implies not only having virtues but also expressing them, therefore it constitutes an activity rather than a state. Moreover, cultivating one's flourishing is not only a self-interested activity, many of its constitutive virtues, logically and or empirically, include other people, say compassion. In some other virtues, such as friendship, the self and other distinction even becomes blurred. Despite the existence of various disabling conditions, most people who receive a decent upbringing are capable of achieving flourishing according to Aristotle. It is therefore not a rarefied ideal for the exclusively few. In a nutshell, then, in light of the function argument, flourishing can be seen as the intrinsically desirable ultimate end of human beings. It involves virtuous, reason-infused activity suitable and peculiar to human beings, achieved over a complete life. As Aristotle simply takes it for granted that the purpose of education replicates the purpose of life, to optimize our natural function, he never produces any distinct argument to motivate the step from general flourishing to educational flourishing. Indeed, the Nicomachean Ethics can be read simultaneously as a handbook about the good life and a guide to good education. The second approach to flourishing to be cast out here is the liberal one. Since its inception in the Enlightenment, liberalism has assumed two main forms. One is a value-thin, rights-based form often called classical liberalism, harking back to John Locke, which resents any comprehensive theories of the good being promoted by the state. The other form, on the other hand, is what we could call liberalism of flourishing, with roots in the writings of John Stuart Mill and the Germanic Bildung approach. According to this approach, the good life is one in which an individual develops her capabilities, and it's the role of the state to create the background conditions that allow this to happen. Insofar as current flourishing theorists are arguing for a liberal take on flourishing, they seem to be doing so from within this tradition of social liberalism of flourishing. Some definitions of flourishing from the liberal traditions could almost have been written by Aristotelians. It's not until we dig deeper into the content and background of the statements that the liberal backbone emerges. Thus, the liberal educational thinker John White understands flourishing as autonomous, wholehearted, and successful immersion in worthwhile pursuits, activities, and relationships. Another liberal thinker, Harry Brickhouse, defines flourishing in educational contexts similarly as referring to a worthwhile life that contains objective goods and is lived from the inside, as he puts it, in the sense that the agent identifies with the pursuit of those goods. Brickhouse is also an avid defender of autonomy as an essential component of liberal flourishing, but he is perhaps less sensitive to the need for external factors enabling the relevant activity to succeed than Aristotle would be. The third educational liberal thinker, Dorothy Ruyter, believes that human flourishing consists of generic goods that are objectively identifiable and the meaningful interpretation of those goods by the person herself, who in the process is able to make the most of her qualities and live her life to the full. So all these three liberal authors, seem to be offering accounts of flourishing that are more in line with the mindset of Western liberal democracies than Aristotelian flourishing, in particular through their emphasis on autonomous choices and individual purposefulness. And you can see there on this slide that actually that is basically the biggest problem with the Aristotelian flourishing model, that he had no sense of individual purpose or meaning, and he was not very strong on transcendent experiences such as awe and elevation, which I'll mention later. However, none of these liberal thinkers that I mentioned offer the sort of value buffet subjectivism into which classical liberalism often tends to collapse. Notably absent from the liberal approach is any specific mention of virtues or character strengths as having a privileged position among the capacities to be optimized, a reverberation of liberalism's reluctance to acknowledge a thick core of universal values. Now, as we turn to two psychologically derived approaches, the contextual landscape changes. The normative focus turns from what is universally valuable, as in Aristotelianism, to what happens to be universally valued. And it turns from the socio-political role of state institutions, as often foregrounded by liberals, to an individual's aspiration for psychological fulfillment. Rooted in a paradigm shift in academic psychology from a deficit model foregrounding illnesses and obstacles towards trying to understand the nature of human well-being by studying happy people, the original position of the father of positive psychology, Martin Seligman, whom we are privileged to have with us here tonight, the original position of Martin Seligman in Authentic Happiness in 2002 was a hybrid model of well-being, but with the center of gravity leaning heavily towards the subjective. In other words, it was not a flourishing account. In 2011, Seligman published his landmark book called Flourish, which contains an emphatic recantation of his earlier well-being account and the makings of a new one. I used to think, Seligman says, quote, that the topic of positive psychology was happiness, that the gold standard for measuring happiness was life satisfaction, unquote. By 2011, however, he believed that the goal of positive psychology is well-being as flourishing. Subjective accounts of happiness flounder down the cul-de-sac of meaninglessness, he says. For example, life satisfaction essentially just measures cheerful mood. So it's not entitled to a central place in any theory that aims to be more than what Seligman calls happyology. Seligman's 2011 revised approach, which carries so many educational implications that it was even given a new name, positive education, continues to be a hybrid one, but it satisfies the above conceptual condition of a flourishing account by prioritizing logically and developmentally the objective features. Seligman devised a list for the actual elements of well-being understood as flourishing, namely positive emotion, engagement, meaning, positive relationships, and accomplishments, the famous PERMA model. In this new account, universally valued virtues and character strengths play an even more prominent role than they did in the 2002 account, because they are now said to undergird all the PERMA elements. Despite the emphasis on objective elements in his account, Seligman acknowledges that one of them, positive emotion, is subjective, and that the other incorporates some subjective components as well. He thus prefers to refer to his approach as pluralistic, or what I called above, hybrid, rather than purely objective. Nevertheless, Seligman now considers all the elements of flourishing to be underpinned by objective moral virtues. The final approach to be introduced here, self-determination theory, is also of psychological provenance and was originally not created specifically as a contribution to a flourishing discourse. However, in recent years, especially after collaboration with an Aristotelian scholar deeply interested in flourishing, Randall Curran, self-determination theory has assumed the contours of a flourishing approach. The focus for present purposes will not be on what self-determination theory has in common with Aristotle, but rather its own unique contribution. That contribution lies in highlighting the importance of need satisfaction for the flourishing life. The previous three approaches do not usually invoke needs when they speak of the virtues or capacities that must be optimized. Rather, they tend to confine the term to what are sometimes called Aristotelian necessities that must be in place before any meaningful flourishing process can commence. For SDT, however, needs are the vital constituents of any flourishing instantiating activity. For instance, good education can be judged on the extent to which it homes in on and allows for the satisfaction of those needs. The needs in question are for autonomy, self-directed engagement with personal values and a sense of self, relatedness, supportive social climate and affirming relationships, and competence, experiencing oneself as capable. And the related potentialities can be broadly categorized as agentive, social, and productive. A central cross-culturally replicated finding in SDT research is that the satisfaction of all three of these basic psychological needs through fulfillment of related potentials is essential to and predictive of well-being, measured in a variety of ways, although for present purposes the relevance for flourishing is the key. Now, a significant insight from SDT research for a practical construct of flourishing stems from decades of research on intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. The upshot there is that it matters not only that the three needs are met, but also how they are met, or perhaps more accurately put, the needs can only be authentically met through motivation of a certain sort, which is intrinsic as opposed to extrinsic. For example, extrinsic motivation in classrooms from high-stakes testing, although possibly meant to enhance competence, will thus not only fail to enhance flourishing as need satisfaction, but actually diminish it. Now I'll turn to a number of mixed flourishing approaches. As already noted a number of times, the four main Western approaches described above all happen to be hybrid. They're hybrid in a conceptual sense with respect to standard taxonomies of well-being accounts, although all prioritize the objective. In current discourse, however, these approaches are often not invoked in their pure form, but they appear as mixed approaches, synthesizing elements from different directions. And notice that this is exactly what OECD asked me to do. They said, well, we've got all these Western and Eastern approaches. Is there any way that you can take them and synthesize them? Notice that the terms hybrid and mixed are not used synonymously in this presentation. Hybrid is used to denote the integration of subjective and objective elements in well-being accounts. Mixed is used to denote the synthesis of various elements from different flourishing approaches within a single promulgated approach. For example, if you somehow try to mix the Aristotelian and the liberal account, or the psychological accounts with the Aristotelian account. I will give you 3 examples of such mixed approaches below. It's perhaps easiest to begin with my own approach from 2020, which I already said to you is probably quite outdated by now, but anyway, here it goes. So I labeled it Neo-Aristotelian. Neo-Aristotelianism is usually taken to mean Aristotelianism updated with recent social scientific findings. However, the Neo-Aristotelian view of flourishing presented in my 2020 book included some significant departures from standard Aristotelianism. This is very important to notice, that the account I presented in 2020 was a mixed account. Although this was not explicitly explained in the book itself, the approach taken can perhaps best be characterized as a synthesis of Aristotelianism, or standard mainstream Aristotelianism, with some elements from the liberal and positive psychological approaches, as well as other non-flourishing specific ones, such as 19th century Romanticism. So, my proposed specification of flourishing runs as follows. This is almost as convoluted as McIntyre's definition of practice. Human flourishing is the relatively unencumbered, freely chosen, and developmentally progressive activity of a meaningful, subjectively purposeful, and objectively valuable life that actualizes satisfactorily an individual human being's natural capacities in areas of specific or species-specific existential tasks at which human beings, as rational, social, moral, and emotional agents, can most successfully excel. One reviewer made a comment about this definition that it sounds like the small print in an insurance contract. I'm afraid it was not meant as a compliment. Worrying that the biggest threat to flourishing accounts to education is one of banality, where the concept simply becomes a shopping trolley for anyone's random selection of goods, my book tries to populate each variable in this complex-sounding definition with sufficient specificity. So I actually spent 2 or 3 pages on each of the variables. Yet in that process, and later in the book, it transpires that some of the variables are essentially non-Aristotelian. To sum up, the departures from Aristotle in my book, those include the accommodation of a modernized liberal notion of an individual's sense of purpose and meaning, which is a concept Aristotle simply didn't have a Greek term for. Second, awe-struck enchantment, which is more in line with positive psychology or even Romanticism than Aristotle. Third, the possibility of radical moral conversions later in life that Aristotle unfortunately didn't believe in. And fourth, a Platonic or spiritual attraction to transpersonal moral ideals, as distinct from Aristotelian emulation of specific persons. Let me now turn to another conceptualization of flourishing from a contribution to a recent UNESCO report by a group of academics. Yeah, next slide. De Ruyter and colleagues. As the lead author is a well-known representative of the liberal approach, and at least one of the other authors, Lindsay Oates, has been linked to positive psychology, one may expect to see a mixed approach. This also happens to be the case. Their definition is as follows, quote, human flourishing is both the optimal continuing development of human beings' potentials and living well as a human being. It means being engaged in relationships and activities that are meaningful, that is aligned with both an individual's own values and humanistic values in a way that is unifying, in a way, that is satisfying to them. Flourishing is conditional on the contribution of individuals and requires an enabling environment, unquote. So similar to my 2020 definition, each variable in this definition is then fleshed out in considerable detail in this UNESCO report. What is most notable about the lengthy elaborations is how they draw upon authors representing all the four main Western approaches mentioned above: Aristotelianism, liberalism, positive psychology, self-determination theory, and even beyond those upon authors advocating more purely objective accounts of flourishing, such as the so-called capabilities view from Sen and Nussbaum. Although this is not spelled out explicitly, the lesson to be learned from de Ruyter's et al.'s helpful overview seems to be that the standard approaches to flourishing in the West align sufficiently for those to be used as ammunition to complement and support each other. So they are sort of fairly optimistic about the possibility of a mixed approach. Next. The final mixed approach presented here is the one advocated by Tyler van der Wiele, director of the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard. His 2017 conceptualization of flourishing is particularly relevant practically because of the extensive use of the flourishing measure that he created. My guess is that in 3 or 4 or 5 years' time, when OECD has finally got this through all its organizational bodies, the measurement they will be using internationally of flourishing will probably be a version of Tyler's much used flourishing measure. His conceptualization of flourishing is particularly relevant because of that. Observing first that flourishing can be understood as a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good, van der Wiele quickly moves towards identifying the life domains that would command general acceptance as the relevant aspects within which flourishing can be explained, namely happiness and life satisfaction, health, both mental and physical, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, and close social relationships. All are arguably at least a part of what we mean by flourishing. Each of those domains arguably also satisfies the following 2 criteria. 1, each domain is generally viewed as an end in itself, and 2, each domain is nearly universally desired. After introducing these domains, van der Wiele devotes most of the rest of his paper to reflecting upon their possible interrelationships or pathways and drawing upon a host of empirical sources to figure out how to measure each of them. This leads to 2 fairly simple self-report measures at the end of the paper, one targeting the 5 domains only and the other adding a 6th domain of financial and material stability. I mean, to tell the truth, if you look at this measure, it looks like it's been created on the back of an envelope. It's just sort of very few simple questions, but it has turned out to have surprisingly powerful psychological properties. Notably, van der Wiele does not explain the theoretical provenance of the 5 domains. He simply refers to an assumed common consensus that these are the domains mattering most for flourishing. That said, component 4 is clearly more Aristotelian and liberal, for example, while the opposite can be said of component 3. Perhaps the implicit message to be taken from van der Wiele's approach is that theorists have spent too much intellectual energy on identifying the precise constituents of flourishing and how these are best labeled. If there is, as he assumes, sufficient convergence in public ideas about what a flourishing life looks like, then most of that energy would probably be better spent on practical interventions and measurements, cultivating flourishing rather than philosophizing endlessly about what flourishing is. So the penultimate section in this presentation is called Closer Look at the Differentials of the Standard Western Approaches. It is now time to shift into a more reflective mode after providing a mostly descriptive account of different flourishing approaches. The crucial remaining question is whether those mixed accounts are similar enough to be synthesizable into a consensual approach that would, for example, form the basis of an international program of education for flourishing. So this is basically the task that OECD gave to me. I mean, not only to synthesize the 4 historical accounts, but also to synthesize the mixed accounts that are based on the historical accounts. So let us begin by extracting a number of representative statements about flourishing from the relevant literatures. Assertions that one comes across in various sources, and ask for each of them what the response from the standard approaches would likely be. This helps to assess the extent of divergence versus convergence. Confessedly, the choice of representative statements will by necessity be slightly arbitrary. I will single out for comparison here 9 statements that are A, common in the background literatures, and B, seem instructive for comparing and contrasting the approaches in question. Next one. The first statement. Flourishing is the ungrounded grounder of all human strivings. Now, this is the most general statement. It comes straight out of the mouths of the Aristotelians, and positive psychologists, at least post Seligman's 2011 book, would presumably agree. As long as positively balanced, that is, pleasant activities are made an indispensable part of flourishing. The standard SDT literature does not make this claim, but Rich Ryan himself does come close to it. The liberal thinkers cited earlier seem to endorse this statement, although most historical accounts of liberalism foreground autonomy cultivation specifically rather than flourishing creation more generally. The second possible consensual statement is this: flourishing is an ongoing activity, not a state, let alone an end state. Now, this claim comes originally, obviously, from Aristotle, but the liberals have taken it up also, and there is no good reason why the other two should not. 3. Flourishing is about capacity accomplishment rather than success, worldly or otherwise. This is a fairly generic statement. The fact that all 4 of the Western approaches under scrutiny here would accept it as salient, however, is likely, for example, because it helps distinguish flourishing approaches to education from the human capital theory. Number 4, flourishing is a relational and communal activity. Those Aristotelians who draw on Aristotle's politics rather than just his Nicomachean ethics would agree. And this seems to tally with one of the basic needs posited by SDT. Positive psychologists have so far not talked much about the flourishing of whole communities. Liberals might worry, however, about the danger of collectivism rearing its ugly head here. Modern-day liberals are not anti-community per se, but they believe that individuals and the pursuit of a flourishing life should be the focal point of flourishing efforts rather than the community. 5. A flourishing life is one in which the individual has found authentic meaning and purpose through autonomous decision-making. This statement lies at the very core of the liberal approach, as well as the SDT one. It's also reflected in the M element of the PERMA model, the meaning element in positive psychology. It is difficult, however, for any mainstream Aristotelians in the audience, it is difficult to square this with a pre-modern approach like that of Aristotle, because he simply had no terms for Enlightenment concepts like autonomy and authenticity. 6. Good character is a necessary but not a sufficient condition of flourishing. Good character, as made up of moral, intellectual, and civic virtues, is the core of the Aristotelian approach, although it does not suffice for flourishing. The positive psychologists agree, at least nominally, for example, Peterson and Seligman in their 2004 book. But their view of character and virtues differs substantially from the Aristotelians, for instance, because the positive psychologists do not posit an intellectual meta-virtue called Phronesis for adjudication when different virtues such as honesty and compassion seem to collide. Neither the liberal nor the SDT approach make direct reference to virtues, however. And indeed, there is no strong intellectualist thread running through SDT in general. 7. Flourishing accounts are grounded in an ontology of value that is not subjectivist. Now, all the four approaches could potentially agree with this, but they would do so for different reasons. The Aristotelians are moral realists. That is, they believe that moral judgments describe an objective world of evaluation, rather than just evaluating subjectively an independent objective world of description. Positive psychologists do not commit themselves to any moral ontology, including subjectivism. They are simply interested in what the majority of people find valuable. The liberals tend to be moral pluralists rather than pure realists or subjectivists. The SDT theorists do not posit a moral ontology, but the focus on universal psychological needs involving psychomoral attributes seems to rule out subjectivism. 8. Flourishing requires some external necessities. It is not sufficient just to have the right mindset to flourish. Now, this is a basic point made by the Aristotelians. Some of you may recall that this is the only time that Aristotle uses the word nonsense in his Nicomachean Ethics, when he talks about the Socratic view that, being good is enough for flourishing. Rubbish, he says. The liberals would probably opt for a thinner set of external necessities, but they would not object in principle, neither would presumably the SDT theorists. This relative consensus is important because it distinguishes the four approaches in question collectively from a number of other approaches, such as the Socratic or the Stoic one, that consider the right mindset, most commonly characterized as moral goodness, to be sufficient for flourishing. Finally, 9. Flourishing requires agents to become attached to values that are bigger than themselves. It is difficult to formulate the need for enchantment and self-transcendence in a way that does not upset the very practically minded Aristotelians. And obviously Aristotle had no concept of awe, for instance, as distinct from sort of mere curious wonder. And also the pluralist liberals. Positive psychologists are very strong on awe and elevation. I recall the work by Keltner on awe, for example. And while these concepts do not figure prominently in SDT theory, they are not incompatible with it. It is precisely at this point, however, that all the four approaches might have something to learn from the great religious and spiritual traditions, such as the Thomistic one, or even from more down-to-earth Confucianism, which nevertheless applies freely transcendent concepts like the Tao or the Way. Final words, I promise. Wisdom research in psychology seemed to be floundering in a sea of divergence until a task force of the competing players summoned by Igor Grossman came up with a consensual account of wisdom accompanied by a list of remaining unresolved issues in 2020. Clearly something similar is arguably needed in the field of flourishing research, at least if the aspirations by OECD and others for internationally endorsed understandings and programs are to become real. In a sense, the mixed approaches described earlier can already be seen as attempts towards reconciliation, as all three of these mixed approaches, mine and de Ruyter's and van der Wiele's, draw in different ways upon more than just one of the four standard historical Western approaches. The answer to the question of a possible consensual position on flourishing depends, therefore, partly on your assessment of the extent to which the mixed approaches achieve their aim. However, these conciliatory approaches are again more than just one, so a further question beckons about the possibility of reconciling the three. So am I, de Ruyter and van der Wiele in the end just saying the same thing or not? This last issue has been given a thorough treatment in a recent article by Blaine Fowers that provides a scathing critique of current theorizing and measures of flourishing as both undermotivated theoretically, as not grounded in any clear philosophies, but simply in the personal intuitions of the researchers, and also culturally biased. That is, presenting as cosmopolitan a view that is grounded only in Western Anglophone assumptions. Next one. So there's a reference there to the Powers article, and I also mentioned briefly 3 new critiques of the Flourishing account, which I don't have time to talk about here, but I can obviously go into in the Q&A if you're interested. So, like I said, I mean, all the opponents that I was looking for in 2020 have certainly appeared. Powers and colleagues consider this cultural bias as an example of a common malaise in Western psychology, which tends to quietly elide non-Western approaches. So they interpret their findings in the form of a dilemma. Either Western researchers present their results as universal, in which case they can be accused of ethnocentrism, or they present them as applicable only in Western contexts, in which case they cannot ground universal conceptions of concepts such as education for flourishing. The authors do not consider their argument to be mainly deconstructive and deflationary, however, nor as potentially paralyzing the field. In contrast, behind the dissensus, they identify some areas of consensus, so even Blaine Powers and his colleagues do point to some kind of a consensus across the globe, such as that flourishing is a measurable or a scalar concept that people experience in degrees, a multidimensional concept that is irreducible to a single variant, and a richer concept of either positive affect or life satisfaction. They recommend the creation of a systematic theory that includes reflections on cultural and theoretical nuances. In essence, then, they recommend the sort of endeavor to which the present paper has aspired to contribute as a first step. They would simply say, don't dream of only trying to reconcile the Western approaches. Returning to the question of a possible universal synthesis of education for flourishing, which OECD, for one, is aiming for and has asked me to explore as a consultant, at least 3 outcomes are possible here. And I think this is the last slide. First, and most optimistically, it could be hoped that a single approach, a theoretical sweet spot, can be identified which synthesizes sufficiently the different focus of the competing approaches in such a way that none of them will find their core message compromised. The potential problem with this outcome is that the synthesized approach will potentially be watered down to the point of banality. Secondly, we could end up with a consensual approach along the lines of Grossman's account of wisdom, in which consensual features are foregrounded, but outstanding non-consensual issues are also acknowledged. Thirdly, and most pessimistically, and this is obviously what OECD is hoping is not going to happen, while a process of synthesis could possibly succeed in excluding certain marginal conceptions as no-go areas for a consensual position, the remaining controversies could still outweigh the agreements, and everyone could just continue to pursue their own agenda of flourishing, or the whole flourishing bandwagon could simply grind to a halt. Which one of these 3 outcomes is most likely is anybody's guess, unless a systematic attempt at reconciliation and synthesis has been made. And OECD says, give it another 3 or 4 years. They move very slowly. In their article on the psychology of flourishing, Powers and colleagues add a caveat. They say, we recognize there are many other theoretical approaches to flourishing, and our approach is unlikely to be universally adopted. This non-finality actually makes our proposal easier because it frees us from the false idea that we should have the final word on flourishing, unquote. These words can be echoed at the end of this presentation and applied to the present context also. In aiming for an overview of the current state of play, this presentation has deliberately avoided the sense of finality that comes from making a strong case for one approach over the others. And as I said, I've already changed my mind considerably since I wrote my 2020 book, although that was already a mixed account, not purely Aristotelian. Although my own views have been made clear in earlier writings, it must be left to you to decide what you think about the credibility of the flourishing agenda, this idea of synthesizing flourishing accounts. this idea in general and the possibility of synthesizing satisfactorily the different approaches to it in particular. Thank you.